The first time I saw Blythe Carson, every person in that room found somewhere else to look. Not all at once. It wasn't dramatic like that. It was the kind of thing you'd only catch from the edges, and I was very much a man of the margins that night. I was working as temp event staff at the Pacific Northwest Conservation Fund's annual charity auction, held at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, guests in gowns and tuxedos that probably cost more than my truck. My job was to keep the hors d'oeuvre moving, replenish the napkin stations, and stay invisible. I was good at invisible, I had practice. My name is Declan Burke. 29 years old, driving rideshare during the day and picking up event gigs at night, doing whatever it took to chip away at the $47,000 in medical debt my mother had left behind after 18 months of cancer treatment. She passed in April. The auction was in November. I was still wearing the same dress shoes I'd worn to her funeral because I hadn't had reason, or money, to replace them. So yes, margins. The auction was raising money for wildlife conservation across the Cascades, and Blythe's father, Harrison Carson, CEO of Carson Pacific Shipping and the evening's lead sponsor, was working the room with the practiced ease of a man who has never once needed to fill a license he didn't want to fill. I recognized him from the framed program cards we'd arranged on every table. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made it tilt slightly in his direction. His daughter was a different story. Blythe entered the main hall about 40 minutes into the cocktail hour. I noticed the room rearranging itself before I fully registered her. A subtle collective shifting that would have been invisible if you weren't watching from an angle no one else occupied. A cluster near the champagne display drifted back half a step as she passed. A couple at the silent auction tables became suddenly absorbed by their bidding paddles. A man who had been laughing loudly turned just slightly away mid-sentence, as if someone had tapped him on the shoulder. Nobody was actively cruel, that almost made it worse. She was wearing a deep green dress, her dark hair pulled back simply, and she moved through the room with the particular posture of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Her right hand and forearm, I only noticed because I was watching from an angle no one else occupied, bore the unmistakable texture of healed burn scarring, the skin slightly raised and irregular from her wrist to just below her elbow. When she reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, she took it with her left hand. She moved to the far corner of the hall, where a large framed photograph of Mount Rainier reflected in a still alpine lake at sunrise hung between two auction placards, and she looked at it with the careful attention of someone who has run out of other places to direct her eyes. I circled the room twice, replenished a napkin station, avoided a conversation between two venture capitalists arguing about autonomous freight routing. On my third pass, Blythe was still in that corner. No one had joined her. The photograph hadn't changed. My supervisor, a sharp, efficient woman named Steph who communicated almost entirely through eyebrows, caught me slowing near the east wall and raised one at me. Keep moving. I kept moving for about 30 more seconds. Then I set my tray on the side table near the service entrance, the way I'd seen the senior staff do when they needed a moment, and I walked across the room. I was aware with every step of exactly what I was doing and what it could cost me. Temp workers don't approach the lead sponsor's family. Temp workers don't initiate conversations at their own discretion. Steph was going to see this. Harrison Carson might see this. I could be pulled from the roster permanently. But there's a kind of aloneness that broadcasts itself on a frequency most people have learned to ignore, and I knew that frequency well. I'd spent the better part of the last year listening to it echo around my own apartment, in the specific silence that settles into a place after the person who made it a home is no longer in it. I stopped beside her, not too close. The photograph was genuinely beautiful. I keep coming back to this one, I said. I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at Rainier, white and enormous against the blue. Something about that reflection. Like the mountain is more real in the water than it is in the sky. A beat of silence. I half expected her to step away. She didn't. It's about 3 stops past perfect, she said quietly, which usually means the photographer knew exactly what they were waiting for. I turned. She was looking at the photograph, not at me, but there was something alive in her expression. Not the careful neutrality she'd carried since she walked in, but something underneath it that had been there all along. You know photography? I asked. I know when someone's chasing the shot instead of letting it come. She paused. This one let it come. We talked about the photograph, then about the auction. She had opinions about which pieces were undervalued and which were riding reputation more than merit, delivered with a dry precision that made me want to keep asking questions just to hear the answers. She explained the Columbia Basin Watershed Initiative. The foundation was funding, with the fluency of someone who had read everything there was to read on the subject, possibly because she had. When I admitted I didn't know enough about salmon habitat monitoring to ask intelligent questions, she explained it in a way that assumed I was capable of understanding rather than just capable of nodding, which I appreciated more than I said. At some point she shifted slightly, and I watched her set her water glass down on the nearby ledge using her right hand, the scarred one, without thinking about it. When she caught me notice, she went still. Sorry, I said, I wasn't staring. You were, she said, not accusatory, just honest. I was, I admitted. I was thinking that I've been carrying trays since 6 o'clock and my hands aren't in great shape either. I held up my left hand, the palm reddened from heat, a burn from an oven rack 2 weeks earlier, still pink and raised across 2 knuckles. She looked at it, then, for the first time that evening, she looked directly at me. That's not a fair comparison, she said. It's an honest one. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the ground beneath one loosening. Blythe Carson, she said. Declan Burke, I work for the hotel tonight. There didn't seem to be any reason to pretend otherwise. I know, she said. I saw you with the tray. It wasn't unkind. Why did you come over? I considered the deflecting answer. I had one ready. Instead, I said something closer to the truth. Because I know what it looks like when someone's been standing alone long enough that they've stopped expecting it to change. The room continued around us. Behind me, somewhere, a bidding paddle went up and a small collective sound rose from a cluster of guests. Blythe was quiet for a moment. That's a lot to read off a stranger. I've been reading rooms all night, I said. It's most of what the job requires. Steph appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision, moving toward me with intent. I reached for my tray. I should get back. Blythe nodded. Then, before I turned, the photograph with the blue heron, 2 panels to the left. It's undervalued by at least $4,000, if you happen to know anyone who's looking. I glanced at it, then at her. I'll pass that along. It was nice to meet you, Declan Burke. You too, Blythe Carson. I thought that would be the entirety of it. A small, strange grace note on an otherwise ordinary evening. The kind of thing you remember for a while and then let go. I was wrong. The following morning I was in my apartment in the Central District, eating cereal over the sink because I hadn't replaced the kitchen table I'd sold to cover a co-payment, when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Is this Declan Burke? The voice was measured, direct, the voice of a man who had not needed to explain himself in a long time. It is, I said. This is Harrison Carson. You spoke with my daughter last night at the auction. My cereal got very interesting. Yes, sir, I said. I'd like to meet with you today if you're available. 11 o'clock. I thought about my rideshare shift. I thought about the 7 reviews I'd need by 4 p.m. to hit my weekly target. I thought about the shoes. I can be there, I said. Carson Pacific's headquarters occupied 6 floors of a glass tower on 5th Avenue, 22 stories above Pike Place Market. Harrison's office looked out over Elliott Bay, and on that clear November morning the Olympic Mountains were visible across the water, white and still. He was shorter than his photograph, compact and precise, the kind of man whose stillness has actual weight. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and I sat, and he looked at me the way I imagined he looked at contracts, assessing load and risk at the same time. Tell me why you crossed the room last night, he said. No wind-up, no warm-up. I respected it. Because your daughter was standing alone, I said. And I know what that costs a person. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a ferry began its slow crossing toward Bainbridge. She hasn't attended one of these events in 8 months, he said. Last night was the first one she agreed to. After the auction, she asked our event coordinator whether there was a record of the staff roster. She asked for your name specifically. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Harrison walked to the window. For a moment he just looked at the bay, And I understood that what he was about to say had been carried a long time before it was said out loud. 2 years ago, Blythe was driving on I-90 near Snoqualmie Pass when a school bus lost its brakes on a downhill grade and went off an embankment. She was a certified first responder, volunteer off-duty, heading back from a weekend in eastern Washington. She was the first person to reach the vehicle. He paused. She pulled 2 children out through a window before anyone else arrived. There was a fuel leak that nobody knew about. She had the second child clear of the bus when the fire started. Another pause, shorter. Her arm was inside the window when it ignited. I looked at my hands on my knees. Both children were uninjured, he said. There were 2 weeks of coverage, local stations, 1 national segment. Then the news cycle moved and the cameras went elsewhere. Blythe was left with the scars and no particularly useful framework for what comes after the world, has briefly decided you're a hero and then forgotten to check back in. He turned from the window. She withdrew, boards she served on, friends she'd had for years, public events. She told me the hardest part wasn't the stares. It was the way people would ask how she was doing, and then watch her arm the entire time she answered, as if the arm were answering a different question than she was. He sat back down across from me. Last night you spoke with her for 37 minutes. She came home, ate a real dinner for the first time in 3 weeks, and told me that someone at the auction had asked her what she thought about a photograph. He looked at me steadily. Not how she was holding up. Not whether the evening was difficult. What she thought. He let that sit between us. She said it was the first time in longer than she could remember that someone had asked her a question that assumed she was still a person with opinions, not a person with a condition. Something tightened in my chest in a way I hadn't expected. I run the Carson Family Foundation alongside the business, he said. First responder training grants, wildfire recovery programs, conservation initiatives. I need someone for community outreach and liaison work, meeting with grantees, representing the foundation publicly, helping us tell the stories of the people we support. The salary is $62,000 to start, benefits from day one. He paused. I am not a sentimental man, Mr. Burke. I am offering you this position because my daughter laughed when she told me about you, and that is a sound I had begun to think I might not hear again for a very long time. I was quiet. The ferry had reached the far shore. When do you need an answer? I said. You're already here, he said. That's answer enough. I started the following Monday. The first months were a recalibration, learning the grant portfolio, meeting the community organizations, understanding how the foundation's work became actual changed lives rather than line items in a report. I was not polished. My suits came from a consignment store on Capitol Hill. I took notes by hand because I typed slowly and asked more questions than was probably efficient. But I learned quickly, and I cared about the work in a way that turned out to matter more than I'd anticipated. Blythe began appearing at the office in those early weeks. Quietly at first, a brief presence in the conference room for a grant review, a stop by her father's desk. We worked in the same orbit for almost a month before we had a real conversation again, and it happened in the break room at 7:30 on a Thursday, both of us reaching for the coffee machine at the same moment. You're here early, she said. Site visit in Tacoma at 9, trying to get through the Rainier Valley application first. She poured her coffee, I poured mine. The building was mostly empty, and the morning had that particular Seattle quiet, gray, and unhurried. How's the outreach going? She asked. Honestly, I keep meeting people who should be receiving twice what we're allocating, and I don't know how to say that diplomatically in the reports. She looked up. Say it undiplomatically. My father respects directness more than he presents. That's useful to know. The heron photograph sold, by the way. Someone apparently took your advice at the auction. Your advice, I said. I just passed it along. She wrapped both hands around her mug, the scarred one and the unscarred one, and looked out the small window above the parking structure. The November sky was doing what Seattle skies do, present, gray, not threatening, just there. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. That night at the auction, you came over and started talking about the painting. She paused. Did you do it because you felt sorry for me? No, I said. I did it because I was jealous of you. She turned. You were standing there looking at something beautiful and you weren't performing anything for anyone, I said. I'd been performing all night. Smile on, tray up, eyes forward. You looked like you were actually somewhere. I wanted to be somewhere too. She considered that. I was trying to disappear. I know, I said, you were very bad at it. And then she laughed, a full, unguarded sound surprised out of her, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether to allow it. Growth rarely looks the way it does in stories. It isn't a single decisive morning of confidence that holds forever. It's a Tuesday where she makes it through a full board call without leaving early, a Wednesday where she doesn't wear long sleeves to a community site visit and doesn't explain why, a February Saturday where she accepts an invitation to speak at a first responder recognition lunch in Bellevue and spends 2 weeks texting me drafts of what she might say, letting me read them, asking which parts rang true and which parts sounded like someone who was trying too hard to be okay. The trolls came, because they always do. An old photograph surfaced alongside a foundation grant piece, and the comments were the kind you don't need to read to be injured by. Knowing they exist is enough. I found her in the foundation library at 9 in the evening, laptop open, face very still. Don't, I said. I'm not, she said, but she clearly was. I sat across from her and put my hand flat on the table, palm up. She looked at it. Then she closed the laptop. Tell me about the Snoqualmie Watershed Grant, I said. I need to understand the monitoring protocol before Thursday's site visit. She knew what I was doing. She did it anyway. She talked for 40 minutes about water temperature gradients and salmon habitat, and what a functioning river sounds like when you're standing in it. And by the end, her hands were moving the way they did when something genuinely interested hers. The right hand, as unself-conscious as the left, both of them punctuating her sentences in the air without ceremony. By spring, the Foundation's first responder program had expanded to 14 counties across Washington and Oregon. Blythe had spoken publicly 4 times. At a hospital event in Spokane, a young woman in the audience lifted her sleeve to show her own burn scarring, an industrial accident, and asked afterward whether it ever stopped feeling like something you owed people an explanation for. Blythe said, "The day I stopped explaining it was the day it stopped owning me, but it took longer than I wanted it to." I was standing near the back of the room. The young woman nodded like she'd been handed something she didn't know she'd been waiting for. I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. The second annual Conservation Gala was held the following November. Same hotel, same chandeliers, a different room in certain ways that are hard to explain, except to say that a room where Blythe Carson is comfortable feels different from a room where she is enduring. She'd chaired the gala committee that year, not in an advisory capacity, not from the background, but as the person who made the decisions and answered for them. I arrived early to help with setup. She arrived at 6 in a dress the color of deep water, the kind of blue that shifts when the light changes. She wore nothing on her right arm. She found me near the auction display, where I was straightening bid sheets with the focus of someone who is nervous and doesn't want anyone to know it. "You're not on staff tonight," she said. "Habit. Declan." I know. She took the bid sheet from my hand and set it down. Around us, guests were filling the hall, the room warming with conversation and the soft sound of a string quartet settling into their first notes near the far windows. We made a slow circuit of the auction display. She knew almost every piece. She'd curated a third of them herself, working with Pacific Northwest artists whose subjects reflected the Foundation's conservation work. She talked about each one with the ease of genuine knowledge, gesturing with both hands, the right one as unconsidered and natural as it had always deserved to be. Nobody who passed us looked away. When the quartet settled into something slower, and the crowd eased into the particular comfort of a room that has decided to enjoy itself, we drifted to the tall windows looking over 2nd Avenue. The city below was dark and lit and moving. She was quiet for a moment. "A year ago I came to this hotel because my father asked me to," she said. "I stood in a corner and waited to feel less like a problem in a room where I didn't belong." I waited. I spent 2 years believing that what happened on that road had taken something from me that was gone permanently, that I'd used up the part of a life where people see you as a complete person. She looked at the city. I thought belonging had an expiration date and I'd already reached mine. "Blythe, let me finish." She turned to look at me, and her voice was level and clear, the voice of someone who has spent time finding the exact words and is ready to use them. The night you came over to that painting, you didn't say anything remarkable. You said the reflection looked more real than the mountain. It's honestly not a very sophisticated observation. Thank you, I said. But you asked me what I thought, she said. Not how I was holding up, not whether I was okay, not whether the evening was hard. You asked me what I thought about a photograph. She paused. I realized I'd been so consumed by how people were looking at me that I had stopped having thoughts that were mine. Everything I'd been thinking for 2 years was about being watched. She looked at me steadily. You gave me my own thoughts back, Declan. That's not a small thing. Across the room, Harrison Carson caught my eye over the shoulder of the person he was speaking with and nodded. Once barely perceptible, the nod of a man who has been watching from a careful distance and is at peace with what he sees. I don't know what to do with that, I said. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. I just needed you to know. She turned back to the city below. You once told me you came over to that corner because you were jealous. Because I looked like I was actually somewhere, like I was present. I remember. I think that's the whole thing, she said quietly. Being present for someone, asking the real question instead of the safe one, showing up in the room when it's easier not to. She let out a slow breath. Courage isn't always what it looks like from the outside. Sometimes it's just walking across a quiet room when everyone else has decided it's more comfortable to stay where they are. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know how rare it is when someone asks what you think instead of how you're managing. You know the difference between being handled and being seen. Blythe Carson taught me that being seen isn't something you earn by surviving correctly or by explaining yourself in the right order. It isn't granted by the people who watched you go through something hard. It's built quietly and without announcement by the people who show up and ask the ordinary questions. What do you think? What do you notice? What do you see in that photograph? And mean every word. I think about the young woman in Spokane who raised her sleeve. I think about every person who came to our foundation events and finally said something out loud in a room where someone had made space for it. I think about what it means to stand at the margins of a gathering and see who is standing alone before anyone closer to the center does. That's the thing about margins. The view from there is different. If this story reached you today, share it with someone you know who has been waiting, maybe for a long time, for someone to ask them the right question. Not whether they're okay, what they think, what they see, what they notice about the world when they're given the space to notice it. Comment the word present if you believe that showing up for someone, really, fully showing up, is one of the bravest things a human being can do. I didn't know what I was doing that November night. I had a tray of food and a pair of funeral shoes and not very much left to lose. But I walked across the room, and everything that came after was different.